All right, grade seven. So we're going to look at the result of the Dutch settlement. We're focusing on a few main topics, mainly being the slaves at the Cape, why slaves were brought to the Cape, where exactly the slaves came from, and how slaves were brought from where they came from to the Cape. So firstly, if we look at slaves at the Cape, before the Dutch arrived, there were no slaves in southern Africa. Right, but during the next 150 years, once the Dutch had settled in southern Africa, they brought over 30,000 slaves to the Cape to work in their homes and on their farms. All right, so why the slaves were brought to the Cape? It's similar to the transatlantic slave trade. So you've learned about the transatlantic slave trade in the previous unit, and we know that many slaves were taken from West Africa to America in order to work on plantations. So they needed manpower. And it was exactly the same scenario for South Africa. Okay, but it was a different slave trade. It wasn't necessarily from Western Africa. A few slaves came from Angola. We'll talk about that now. But most of the slaves came from the Spice Islands. So basically, you had the Dutch, which were up here. They were sailing down past Africa, all right, and then past the tip of southern Africa to get to the Spice Islands. As you learned in the previous unit, they used Cape Town as a stopping point, because these guys were using very old school ships. It wasn't like the cruisers that you have nowadays. So they were very limited to how much food they could bring along with them. Because they would run out of fresh food, a lot of sailors became malnourished and they would get diseases such as scurvy and so on. So it was important that they had a rest stop so they could repack food onto the ships and get a new fresh supply of food before they continued with their journey to the Spice Islands. So the reason why they were going to the Spice Islands obviously is to trade, and as we spoke about, spices were very valuable in those years. So why they brought the slaves to Cape Town or to Southern Africa was, one, for manpower. They needed help on the farms because the demand had become so big, and many Dutch settlers were passing by. There was a massive demand for food. So they had to grow more crops, and therefore they needed slaves to help with the manpower, just as on the plantations in America. So where the slaves came from, as we said, initially some of them came from Angola, which is just north of South Africa, right? And that was, again, slaves that were traded for guns, etc. But in this case, for Southern Africa, especially in the Cape, many of the slaves came from Malaysia, etc. And that's why you may have heard the term Cape Malay. All right, and a lot of our food, like Cape Malay, Cook Sisters, etc., are all influenced by this, but we'll talk about that a bit later on in the term. So how the slaves were brought to the Cape: most of the slaves were captured in raids or wars and sold to slave traders. Some were sold by their rulers, who traded them for guns, and some slaves were sold at the Cape by the VOC officials on their way home to Europe, right, from the Dutch colonies and Asia. So, as I said again, all the slaves, they were either through trade, captured through raids and wars, or they were sold off for guns, etc. in Angola. So that's the first part of the result of that settlement. We look mainly at slaves, where the slaves came from and why they were captured. The other side of the spectrum is to put yourself in the slave's perspective. So in history, you're going to have to do this quite a bit. You have to look at sources, read through sources, gather information, and then put yourself in that place. Remember, in history, we always say where it happened, why it happened, how it happened, etc. So it's important that you remember those questions and you answer yourself those questions as you go through the work. So when you look at the sources on page 108 and you read through what it was like to be a slave and the causes and effects of slave resistance in the Cape, I want you to think about these things, because it's going to help you when you move on to activity 3 now, right, where you're going to have to do this as individual work, but you'll read and look at the sources and then complete activity 3.